all together.
Great. So I was thinking about it when I saw the groups that you were in. I saw there was one on self-organization and then another on emergence, which has had me sitting with how I think about the relationship between those two things. Because I think for me, it's a matter of perspective. They are pointing at the same territory, and self-organization is what you get out of the process of emergence. So I think of self-organization as descriptive of what's going on, and emergence as the how it happens. And others may see it differently, but that's how I relate to those two terms. So a lot about chaos and disruption, and is it a precondition? I do believe it is, that the gift of disruption is it interrupts the status quo, and it can lead to chaos. It can also lead to emergence. I'm curious, sir, have any of you run into David Snowden's work? I see a couple of heads sort of
It's part of the
nodding.
readings for the course. It's kind of the non-essential readings, but it's definitely part of the course.
Well, it's a funny pronunciation, Kneffen. He does this nice framing that talks about, simplicity and complicated, complex, and chaotic. And it makes for a nice diagnostic. So I would point you to his work to think about the relationship amongst these different frames for deciding what makes sense to do when. For me, in many ways, the personal journey started with disruption. And one of the lessons, and that started me on the path where I ran into open space. And interestingly, Harrison Owen, creator of open space, sort of backed into seeing complexity as a way of explaining, and self-organization, explaining what was going on and why it worked. And just the naming of that led me on a journey to read about complexity from a scientific point of view. And one of the things that I found quite striking was that nobody had seemed to apply it to human systems in a way that I found meaningful. And so between experimenting with the use principally of open space, and over time bringing in the mindset of the appreciative from appreciative inquiry, it led me down a path to understand how the dynamics that were described by the scientists could be used in thinking about how emergence, complexity, self-organization, emergence applied to the work of what I now think of more as hosting than facilitation. And I make the distinction because what I found is that most of the people trained in traditional forms of facilitation seemed to want to control what was going on. And the notion of being apart from the system, whereas with hosting, like throwing a good party, I know I am part of the system and can be changed by what goes on. And so the basic pattern that I found, the big light bulb ahas, I was trying to understand the underlying patterns of working with systems, of working with the diversity of people who make up any system. The aha was that all change begins with disruption. And if you think about it, that makes a good deal of sense, because if things are status quo and they're working and things are smooth, there's no need for change. And so disruption, I came to understand as the doorway into change. And because we tend to, as humans, want to be in denial or resist it, that tends to be our first default reaction to as a disruption is, can we ignore it or just, fix the little thing that's going wrong and go back to doing things the way that we were doing them. And with minor nuisances, a broken part, that can work. But if there is something deeper going on, a deeper issue, it will come back to haunt you and tend to get louder or bigger or more disruptive if we continue to ignore it. And so one of the key lessons for me in working with disruption was to learn to get curious about it, to be in inquiry. And what I came to, I'm actually gonna screen share up a picture.
Hold on, I'll make you the host. 1 second.
Say that again.
I'll make you the host so that you can share. 1 second.
I think I have. Oh,
You have?
It is disabled. Okay.
1 second.
Actually, I'll go through.
Okay, you're the host now. You can share.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share two pictures actually. So this first one here is the pattern of how I tend to think of the process of emergence. So we go from a coherent system, something disrupts it. And while, this tends to be a pretty emotional state for most of us because things die. Business as usual is no more. So this is where developing a different relationship, a healthy relationship with disruption can help. But the gist of it is, when coherence is broken apart, things fall apart. And that becomes what we often experience as chaotic because it can be overwhelming. There's a lot going on, and it can be the place of lots of experimentation. And while that's happening, there's a seeking of differences that can make a difference. And ultimately, clusters start to form, and a set of principles, common agreements, if you will, generative image that can move us into the future, emerge in a new coherence forms that tends to be more complex in nature and a different kind of system. So if this is a predictable pattern of what happens in a complex system, how do we work with it? And this is the pattern that shapes the way I have found that informs the way I design. So given we know that disruption is an entry point, how do we create a space that feels less chaotic in the midst of chaos? where we can get a handle on it. And I find that there are three qualities that enable us to create what I tend to think of as a bubble in the midst of chaos. And the first and most foundational for me is to name purpose. Getting clear about purpose, whether it's as an individual or whether it's as a group or whether it's as a system, acts as a means of focusing our attention. And so doing that through a possibility-oriented question is one of the most powerful ways of working in a chaotic situation in disruption that I have found. So, for example, it was homelessness has been a major issue in the Seattle area. And a few years ago, doing some work with a diverse group of people here in Seattle on how do we address homelessness. And we found ourselves scratching our head trying to think of a question that could provide a sense of focus and orientation. And we came to a question around how do we engage with creativity, compassion, and community to address homelessness. And that came out of speaking to, working with a diverse organizing group around what they were looking for, what they wanted. That question enabled us to think about who makes up the system so that we could invite the diversity present. And diversity is important because if you have the same conversation with the same group of people, you are less likely to come up with new insights and ideas. So who cares about this issue? And actually, in many ways, the story of the workshop, the Appreciative Inquiry workshop in Ramallah was very much a discovering that as we went. So I'll come back to that story in a moment. And then the third part of the art is to welcome who and what shows up. So creating a sense of belonging, just a snippet of doing that. I have a colleague who is working on questions of parenting in a very diverse part of Chicago. And one of the things they did, there were people coming from many different cultures. And so when they set the tables for a World Cafe kind of experience, they used tablecloths from all of the different cultures of the people who were coming in the room, which set an immediate signal to people that they were welcome. So creating a space through asking a possibility-oriented question that acts as a focus on purpose, inviting the diversity of the system, and attending to a spirit of welcome and belonging, creates the conditions in which people will show up authentically, express what's important to them, and enables connections. So much of the design, no matter what practices you are doing, about are about creating spaces in which people feel free to express themselves and make connections with others. So in seeking the differences that make a difference, this is a way of creating a field in which interactions take place, which is what enables clusters to form, and to be listening for meaning to what is cohering, such that we come out of the other end with a sense of meaning around which a new system emerges, coheres. And of course, something will disrupt it disrupted again, at which point we can start seeking a question that around that acts as an attractor. So I'm going to stop here for a moment, stop the screen sharing here, and see what is evoked in what I've said, and we'll go from there.
May I ask a question?
Please, Sharon.
Do you have any, like when I hear you and when also we are studying this terminology at, with Tova and Rotem, it reminds me in many ways the theory of Ronald Heffetz, adaptive leadership. And I was wondering, he has different terminology, but in many ways, there are a lot of similarities between, I think, between these two theories. And I was wondering, how do you see each other?
Ironically, the Heifetz and Linsky did a blurb for engaging emergence. I think we point into the same territory through slightly different lenses. So I agree with you. It's quite complementary. I keep thinking about the view from the balcony, and I think of my work as the view from inside the mess. So it's it is, how do you be adaptive? And I think that we are adaptive by being curious and empathetic, asking questions that point us towards possibilities, and inviting diversity present. So, and listening for what's emerging. What are the patterns that are arising? Am I answering your question?
I think so. Yes. Thank you.
Peggy, can I drill down into the disruption issue, because
Sure.
Disruption is the starting point, but as you said, dialogic process are always disruptive by themselves. They emerge disruption. So and you said disruption can be, we can turn disruption into attractor, into something that is a forward movement, yes, moving forward. So in this point of facilitation, how if you can say something about, from your experience, how can you turn disruption into attractor, into a positive movement?
That's where the questions come in. So an attractive question will turn a disruption into an attractor. So rather than so I'll use the AI workshop in Ramallah as an example. And by the way, the reason I was using appreciative inquiry in that situation was that the invitation there had been to do a workshop on appreciative inquiry. So it was sort of a condition going into that particular bit of the work. It was Tova and Avner Haramadi, whom I suspect some of you know, had invited me to do a workshop in Israel, and they connected me with another colleague, a Palestinian colleague, Carol Daniel, who asked me to come to Ramallah to do the workshop there as well. And so in my preparation for it, I actually ended up talking with Diana Whitney because I was looking for a question. I like to teach a practice by doing the practice. And so I had asked Carol what was a question that might be of interest to the participants. And she said, living with the occupation. And I certainly did not feel equipped to write appreciative inquiry questions about living with the occupation. And so I had a conversation with Diana Whitney, and we, in case she had any thoughts on that, she basically agreed with me that I simply didn't have the life experience to do that without being in consultation. And so as a starting point for the workshop, she suggested a question on leadership. So first day of the workshop, by the end of the day, as people were, had this experience of working with appreciative questions on leadership, this is many years ago, Arafat was still alive. And the questions at the end of the day that placed people at, they were still looking at leadership as an external. Basically their responses to what they had done was really about how do we get a better Arafat? And so I left the day scratching my head saying, this is not landing. What can I do? And so we started the next morning sitting in a circle, about 20 of us. And people started talking about how hard their life was. So I thought, maybe we need to, I asked, would you be willing to practice this work by developing questions of an appreciative way of living with the occupation? So in a sense, this, in a way, the occupation was, was certainly normal, but it was certainly disruptive. And people split. So I'm making this up. This was very much an emergent process. I'd abandoned my script for the workshop because what we were doing hadn't been working. And people, I had them do something that I will often do in moments like this, where I'm not sure what to do, is invite people to identify a question that they want to pursue in the moment, and then cluster them. And so each person wrote their question. I literally had them stand up, read their question, and find their kindred spirits. We ended up with 4 clusters. And the one that always stays with me the most, the groups are actually in the article that I put in that link, but the one that I found most fascinating was a group that gathered around checkpoints. And each of them, their task was to write a question about, in this case, checkpoints that was appreciative. And the question that they came to was, imagine a time that you've been at a checkpoint and something useful happened. And what we did, what was it like? What was the experience? There was another group that did something on turning the checkpoints. Imagine a time where the checkpoints are no longer useful. What do we do with the physical spaces? And then again, in making it up as I was going along, everybody took their own questions and interviewed the other person with their question. And then when we got back together as a whole group, and I knew we were onto something when I heard people giggling and laughing, because these questions, this place that they were in first thing in the morning, where everyone was talking about how hard their life was, people were suddenly in a place of imagination and creativity. And when we came back together as a group, they were asking, what they were talking about were possibilities. So for example, the group with useful checkpoints talked about how it brought them closer together as a community, because they would help the elders or people for whom waiting for hours was hardest on. They would bring them to the front of the line. So they discovered new things and sense of community in this situation. The ones who did the question about what do we turn this into, imagined a place for Israeli and Palestinian youth to interact as a youth center in these places that used to divide. And the lessons that they came away, they went from feeling like victims to finding a sense of their own power in a difficult situation. And that was the lesson that stayed long after the workshop. The insight that you couldn't, that it's not a matter of just cooperating with friends, but also cooperating with those that you see in opposition, which was another lesson out of their stories. So the best way I have found when dealing with disruption is, once I catch my breath from my own resistance or anger or fear or grief, is to find, what can I be curious about in this situation? What is a question that I can ask that can bring some hope? And asking if that question attracts others who might also be drawn to that question. And then I'm no longer alone. And in that companionship, we start to find a foothold and find others who are asking complementary questions. There's something that I was reading recently about the nature of belonging and borders, and that we treat them as things to divide. And yet, if you look at what nature does at borders, those are places of connection. And they are ripe for innovation. And so in that way, this sense of emergence happens at the borders. One other facilitation tip I'll throw in around this. If you want to think about, how do you think about the diversity of a system who needs to belong? This is something I learned from Marv Weisbord and Sandra Janoff, who created Future Search. That a way of thinking about the diversity of a system is that you want the people who are in, which is an acronym for authority, resources, expertise, information, and need. So that is a way of thinking about who to invite. And then I also bring a layer of demographics, and it's race, class, gender, generation, geography, and then politics and religion. And that way of thinking about demographics comes from a journalism education organization called the Maynard Institute. And so I look at, when I'm thinking, working with a client about how do we think about the diversity of the system, we'll draw a graphic and use those ideas as prompts. So if the question we're asking is in the center, who needs to be involved? I'll bring, we'll draw bubbles that represent the size of the different constituencies and how close the bubble is to the question. So for example, I did some work with the Forest Service and communities about wildfires in California a number of years before they were as devastating as they are now. And, the city, state, local government, the communities that lived in the mountains, and interesting insurance companies, which was a small population, but with a lot of influence, was also close to the center. Environmental groups, etc., helped us form a picture of who makes up the system so that they could be conscious about their inviting. So again, I'll stop. What are you hearing and what questions does it raise for you?
It brought me to inviting people that don't usually come. And how do you do that? Because if we really want them to come from free will and curiosity, and we have different kinds of ability to be, my English. To be available, to be available, to engage, to these kind of processes. So I'm really curious. Maybe you have even examples that people you wouldn't expect to engage because of their life experience or time or loads in life came. Yeah.
I would like to add to that, because we had some experiences in Israel. We tried to bring, all the diversity of the society, and really it was so disappointing. We didn't succeed to bring, the whole system.
It is the most challenging and time-consuming aspect of the work. And it doesn't happen overnight. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second is that the forming of the question is best done with a diverse group. And so it requires finding partners from the beginning. If I go in this country where race is very often the most difficult to mention, if a group of white people go in and say, come do this thing with me, don't expect it to succeed. If I come with humility and seek a partner who is willing to explore a question together, then we begin to find, rather than a boundary, a connection at that border, such that we go hand in hand. I have a colleague who's done a lot of work across political boundaries, and they wanted to do something on the environment. And so this was a progressive. They went looking for conservatives to work with. And what they found was that the conservatives didn't talk about environment, they talked about energy security. And so they ended up creating a question that was around, how do we create a sustainable and secure source of energy. And because they went into it together, they were able to invite more broadly. But it's work that requires a good deal of listening and humility and willing to be tested. Very often the idea of creating a microcosm when you want to do this work at the scale of society, that it is a question of time and humility and a willingness to find the border crossers. In this country, I very often find that the people who I end up working with are people who live in both worlds. A Black person who is raised by white parents, for example. This is just a pattern that I have noticed, or as I think about the Black friends that I have in my life, which happened in part because I consciously set out to make friends with people who thought differently, worked differently, come from different backgrounds. That they tended to be Black people who had grown up in white neighborhoods or had gone to a school that was predominantly white, or in some way they were boundary crossers. I think about work that Avner and Tova did many years ago. And what I know of Avner's family is that they were living in Israel before the Second World War. His family had deep roots, and many Palestinian, before the language of Palestinian was even used, had many friends in the Arab community. And so he had connections and the capacity to have conversations and make connections that provided a first step. Am I answering your question? What else can I help with? I see it.
I can continue, guys. You gotta pick up the phone, the microphone and talk.
Yeah.
I
Well, Sharon, yeah.
would like
Please.
also to join maybe tomorrow. I don't know if it's the same question, but edge of chaos. Where do you see it? Because you use a lot, you use the terminology of disruption, and I was wondering how it relates to edge of chaos.
It's probably the same place. The edge of chaos talk tends to be the place between the known and the unknown, which is a border. It's this vibrant territory where things can happen, where it is not so overwhelming that you are simply lost. And I find the edge of chaos is that place of seeking questions. So one of the ways I think about it is it's a place where I bring what I know and the strengths that I have and hold them lightly, so that there is room to be in a place of not knowing, confident that I have the strength to be present to what shows up. And it's territory that I prefer going into with others, so that among us we can bring different perspectives and different skills to bear. So I think it is another name for the same territory that we are already talking about. And I think what that language brings is the recognition of that's the fertile constructive territory where there is the existence of both the known and the unknown.
Thank you.
How about somebody who hasn't asked a question? Or actually, you know what, with 6 minutes left, what I'd like to suggest is that we do a checkout and hear once again from each of you. And again, this is part of my practice. Our questions helped us step into the not knowing of what we were going to talk about today. We've ranged far and wide, pursuing the differences that might make a difference, exploring the territory of the unknown based on what has authentic interest for you and making connections as we do it. And so now I ask the question of what meaning can we draw from what we have done at this stage? And it's a moment in time. So it's a chance to check in and say, what might we know now that we didn't know coming in? So my invitation is for each to speak to a gift or a nugget or an insight that you take from what you've heard and what we've explored today. So whomever wishes to start, please do. And since our time is a bit short, I'll ask that you pass, when you are complete, pass to someone else and ask them to speak. And of course, you are always welcome to pass.
I'll speak. I joined a little lately. I didn't know about the meeting, so I came in spontaneously. And I was so curious to know who this Peggy is that Tova is talking about her like a good friend. And you are so cheerful that I could understand it quite quickly. I enjoyed every word of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there a gift, is there a nugget that you are taking from this, which you've heard?
The gift. I loved the diversity we're talking about, the work you have to make about yourself when you want to achieve something, to ask yourself, what do you have to change to make it work?
Thank you. And if you would pass it to someone else.
Excuse me, I didn't understand.
מבקשת שתעבירי את זה עכשיו, אתה בכלי דיבור.
Okay, to Anat, please.
I invited Rachel, that's why she passed the voice to me. Actually, I enjoyed the meeting and I learned so much from what you said and your answers, and I take the gift of rounds of questions that, like, I liked it, like you phrased something and then you asked for questions and phrased and questions. I think it's I learned from it good methodology. Thank you. So I'll pass it to Daniel.
Thank you. For me, I think that your closing remarks were very insightful. Where I bring what I know and the skills that I have, and I hold them lightly. I feel like it's a very powerful thing to hold it lightly. You know, oftentimes people hold what they know to be true. They hold on to that for dear life, and that resists that's the resistance to change. So I take that. Thank you. and I pass on to Tamar in black.
איזו תמר?
You.
אני? First of all, thank you very much. It took me back to many years I facilitated groups of Palestinians and Israelis. And the place of the facilitator as an Israeli, a Jewish woman, was I apart from the group or a part of the group? These are two sentences I'm taking to continue thinking about. And thank you very much. I pass it to Tamar.
I think my gift from you today was that it was more realistic to me. I think the way you spoke about it, I could really imagine it. And like thinking of you holding hands with people, diving in or taking this breath, and okay, when I catch my breath, then I go in, was like really meaningful for me to understand like these moments and how you operate in them. So thank you so much. I pass it to Tina and Ilan.
I won't get one free. What's one of the highlights I heard is about resistance. Peggy, you were talking about when there is a change and it's natural to have resistance from the facilitator or from people who is deep in the process. So just the mere mentioning it, naming it, rather than just pushing it aside and then working with it, just felt real and authentic here.
Great.
I think I'm saying with the power of questions as almost the redeeming power of questions, and the ability to truly be with a question without seeking a answer and dropping all the known answers aside, and the courage that comes with that. Hanoch.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. The present I'm taking is about the answer you gave to Tamar about the question how you bring all the different people. So you said it's this is one of the most hard things, and what you said is you have to have to do partnership with those different kind of people that you want to bring. So like the word you used, like to make a microcosmos. So this is what I liked it. This is the present. And Sharon.
Thank you. I actually would like to continue from Hanoch's point. I have like a picture in my mind of like a dance, talking about including the whole system. And it feels to me like a position of being proactive, and then like something that is very attentive and at the same time very proactive. And the ability to really be able to include all partners in the system is you gave life to understanding what we're talking about. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I will pass on to Heli.
Hi, good evening. Sorry, I joined late. I feel like I sorry for my voice. I'm sick. I took a lot of actually presents. One of them is that I feel confident to go back to your text, Peggy, and read it again, because it was like an enigma for me. And now after I heard you talking about it and the example, so it make it clearest. And I love the thing that you said, you didn't say, I understood that it's our responsibility to take ourselves in a disruption times and to think what curiosity question I can ask to make people join to hope or something. And it really touched me and it's really present for me. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I always, the selfish part of me is always fed by what you learn, because I learn how important the questions are, and the mystery of bringing the diversity of a system together. So thank you for those clues of where the challenging parts are for you and others. So it's good for me to know. I was, I know we're over our time, so I will wrap up here really quickly. I was going to drop another link in the chat, which is, but somehow oh, there's my chat window. It disappeared on my screen. So engaging emergence goes into depth on what we've been talking about. I'm putting a link to a chapter that I wrote a couple years ago, that if I were writing engaging emergence today, this would be how I would frame it. So this is a shorter version. And you'll find other brief writings on my website that may be helpful to you as you proceed. Thank you for your questions and your interest. And I know that you have been or are working with, I think, one of the best teachers in the world. So have a great adventure, those of you who are just starting, because the work you are doing, I think, is more essential than ever as our world enters into an increasingly disruptive time. So the more people who are comfortable or have some insight into working on the edge of chaos, better. And so
Thank you so
enjoy
much.
and
Thank
learn.
you everyone for making time and for.
Thank you so much, Peggy.
Yep, you're welcome. Laila Tov.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.